So some of the things that organizations and executives need to be focusing around cybersecurity is it's always about taking a risk-based approach. You need to be managing risk. Cybersecurity, historically was about making sure you have protection and you're able to keep, criminals out of your business and from accessing sensitive data. But today it's really about making sure you actually understand the risk of the business and be able to take that risk-based approach. So the executives in the organization really need to understand, how to tie cybersecurity and the actual business values together. This is something that's been missing for many years, and organizations really need to bring those much closer. And this means that looking at how can you make security much more add value to the business itself. There's actually an interesting thing was most security solutions out there really take it from a cost perspective. They have a hard cost, they don't add any value to the business other than making sure they have some type of protection. And organizations are really now looking at security. How can security add value? How can it make a difference to the business? And it was an interesting story that I heard not long ago that from Africa was around farmers who were actually protecting their crops. And they had a major problem with elephants storming into the actual crops and destroying a lot of the value that they had. And what they looked was how can they actually protect their crops and stop elephants from running into the fields. And they looked at basically the natural defensive technique for elephants to keep them out is they're afraid of bees. So these farmers actually then installed beehives around their farms. And what happened was they were able to now protect their crops and also sell the honey for added value. And organizations are now looking at cybersecurity in the same perspective. And there's very few security solutions out there that can really add the same value to organizations. And one of those areas is privileged access management. Privileged access management is one of the few security solutions out in the industry that can help organizations not only protect the sensitive information that they need to, but also actually add value and help make their employees much more effective, much more consistent, and actually ultimately save time and make their jobs easier. And this is why organizations really need to take a much more closer and much more valued approach to cybersecurity and really look into privileged access management. This is really around how can organizations really empower their employees. And this is something that organizations, historically we've been making victims out of employees, but we need to take a change in focus. We need to look at how we can actually empower employees. In many cases, organizations have looked at employees just from the devices that they provide them, but we need to take it a different approach. We need to look at employees. Actually, most times cybercriminals actually target them first from their home machines, from their personal devices, from their personal social activities. So we need to make sure that we empower employees not just from the work devices that they use, but also to everything that they do in social media and activities. We need to give them the actual tools and the skills and awareness and knowledge to protect them at both work and at home, even helping them go beyond to protecting their family and friends. A saying that I have is that we're actually only secure as the people around us, as the social sphere that we have. So the more that we make the social sphere around us more secure, the more secure it makes us. And this is really where we get into privileged access management, helps employees be more secure at both work and at home. And organizations really need to take a look at this. How can we empower employees? How we can actually empower employees to be basically not only protected at work, but also at home as well, and really make them happy and more efficient at doing what they're doing. And privileged access management helps empower happy employees. This is really when it comes down to compliance. Out there, we're seeing a very major change around industry compliance. We've seen it around things like ISO, PCI, we've seen it with the NIST framework in the US, we've also seen it with the upcoming GDPR and NIST directive. And many countries around the world have been taking a very similar approach at looking at all these different compliances and adopting them to their own government regulations. And this is something that we've seen across the board. But one of the things that we see across, which is almost mandatory across every single one of these compliance regulations, is around access controls. Access controls is something that many regulations are looking to enforce. especially when it comes to making sure they have access to the right information. And this goes across every single one of them. So it means that if you're an organization that has to comply with any type of regulatory or compliance or industry certification, then access controls is something that you must do. It's not something that you can just do as a checkbox. It's not something you can just put as a policy or call it as something that you're doing as a process, but you really need to implement it fully. Access controls is something that you can't avoid, and it's something that you have to really get into looking at seriously from not just a compliance perspective, but from a security perspective. And by really looking at solutions out there like privileged access management will help you do a fast track to compliance and really make your organization much more protected when it comes to sensitive data. This is really what it comes down to organizations, that what's the things that I recommend to, as an ethical hacker myself and somebody that is asked about, how do I, get access to organizations, how do I breach into their networks, and how to, what makes my job more difficult. And this is when, I've been asked many times about, what's the things that organizations can do to make it more difficult for me to ethically hack into organizations. And there's 5 key points that I recommend that if you really put these in place, it will actually make my job more difficult. And these 5 points are, the first one is make sure that you have much more knowledgeable employees. If employees have more awareness, more knowledge, more cyber hygiene, they can become the early warning systems and actually potential compromises. The more your employees are able to detect and be able to identify potential breaches, the more you empower them to be able to communicate to the IT and warn them before something happens. So make sure you have a good cyber awareness program across all employees. The second point is remove the complexity. Our security solutions have been overly complex for many, many years, for even the past 20 years, and we need to start making cybersecurity simplified, easier to use, and less complex. We have to get into where actually a people-centric approach, where we have actually a balance between technology and people, can really make sure the more people can easily understand what the security solution is telling them, they can make more decisive, more important decisions and more secure decisions. So we have to actually remove the complexity and start actually making sure that the organizations are deploying simplified, easy to use security solutions. The third point is also making sure that you implement things like two-factor and multi-factor authentication. By implementing two-factor multi-factor authentication, we're making sure that actually a password is not the only thing protecting your sensitive accounts. Like emails, like privileged access, multi-factor, two-factor authentication will make it much more challenging, more difficult for hackers or cybercriminals to access your sensitive information. The fourth point is around encryption. Encryption, making sure that actually your data is protected, is private, and encryption is enforced. This will also make it more difficult that when criminals do get access to your infrastructure, that you're not giving them easy access to the sensitive data. And the fifth and final point, is adopting privileged access management. The more you put in privileged access management for your sensitive accounts, the more difficult it is for me in order to gain access to multiple systems and to laterally move, and also make it more difficult because it means every time I return, I actually have to keep going through the actual hacking techniques to gain access again, making it more likely for me to be detected. So these are the kind of 5 points that I recommend that makes it more difficult for cyber criminals and myself as an ethical hacker to gain access to organizations. Instant response. Ultimately many organizations are going to be breached. You're going to be having to respond to incidents. And one of the things is that you don't want to be putting your incident response plan in place when you're actually going through a crisis. Instant response, the more, I kind of have a metaphor saying that, it's great having many fire alarms when you have no fire people or fire responders to actually respond to the incident. So it's not only important to be able to do detection, but it's also important to be able to remediate and recover quickly and efficiently. And one thing I'd say is don't spend too much time and wasting resources at doing basically blaming nation states or looking for attribution to, basically have some type of, lack of accountability. It's up to organizations to make sure the incident response plan is focused at making sure that the customers, partners, and employees are first. that making sure that they focus on the instant response to recovery, getting back to business, and responding in an effective way. And this really comes down to making sure an instant response plan is in place. And this really means that the earlier you detect, the earlier you respond, and makes the recovery process actually more effective, and also the incident less costly. So making sure that, yes, instant response should be a priority and should be something organizations should have in place.